Good morning. Welcome to Member Focus Monday. I'm Cristina Schaefer, Director of Social Media for HAR, and we have a return guest this morning, Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi. Welcome back to our program.
Thank you, Cristina. It's always a pleasure to be with you all. It's been now almost a year and a half, and we've been doing this a couple of times, so I'm very excited to be back.
Yes, and we are very excited to have you back. We have a lot of questions planned for this morning. And I know we have a limited amount of time with you because you're a very busy person. So we'll get right into it. If you are watching this morning and you have questions for Dr. Bottazzi, type them in, and we will try our best to get to those questions. I think for the most part, most of us have a lot of the same questions. So I think we'll be able to answer mostly everybody's questions today. But before we get into that, if you could just tell us, for anybody who hasn't seen you on our program before, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, absolutely. So I am a vaccine scientist, and I work at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital, co-leading a vaccine development center alongside Dr. Peter Hotes. And we actually do develop these so-called prototypes of vaccines, including, of course, COVID-19. And then we use our know-how, our prototype vaccines to transfer them to potential vaccine manufacturers. And in fact, for COVID-19, we do have one that was transferred back in 2020 to a manufacturer company in India. And now it's really advancing very nicely and very promising towards potential licensure, ideally for use not only in India, but also globally, using conventional technologies, a little bit different from what we hear about the RNA vaccines and the adenovirus vaccines. But we also use those technologies in our labs, except for COVID-19, we're using what we call a subunit protein vaccine. But they're all very similar, as we're going to get into shortly.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the first questions that I have for you about the differences between the different brands of vaccine, if you will. You know, some of the most popular, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. There's also others, but how do they each work? Is there a benefit to one over the other? Or is there any recommendation you'd make for somebody who's considering one of them?
Sure. So scientifically, all the vaccines and all the vaccine producers and all of us developers are attacking the virus, trying to target vaccines against pretty much the same molecule. We all are interested in blocking the virus to enter into our cells. And the way that the virus does that is by using its spike protein, which is like a key. And that's the one that actually binds to the receptors in our cells. So all the vaccines ultimately are to try to induce a response that would block that interaction between the spike protein of the virus and our cellular receptors, right? Okay. So ultimately, all of them are going to be doing pretty much the same thing. But the way that we produce the vaccines and the platforms, we call them, or the technologies used are slightly different, right? So the RNA vaccines predicate on the fact that we use a code of the virus, a spike protein, and we, as an RNA code, and we give it to our bodies. Our bodies reads that code, right? We have the machinery to be able to read it. We then convert that code into a protein, and that's the protein that mimics the spike that is presented to our immune system. When you use the Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca, which uses a viral vector or an adenovirus vector as a backbone, we are doing the same thing. Instead of giving a code, we actually give the code in a vector, which is this virus vector, because we make it look like it's a real virus, but it's really not a virus because it's a kind of an artificial, non-pathogenic virus. But ultimately, our body sees the same thing, sees a code, makes a protein, the protein is presented, and we, of course, are protected. Our conventional platform, which is probably the next generation of vaccines that are going to come along, is that instead of giving anybody a code, we just give the protein directly. Okay. But ultimately, all do the same exact thing, Cristina.
Okay. And I want to ask you about boosters later, but it feels right to ask this question now. If you received, one brand of vaccine and then, down the road we have boosters, do you need to stick with that same brand because of how it was presenting to your body, or do you think it would even matter?
So first of all, there are ongoing studies to really clearly look at, what it would mean to mix and match using products that were made through different, again, platforms, right? But scientifically, we don't foresee that there's going to be any concerns because, again, we're basically just presenting our immune system with, again, the same exact thing, right? It's just that and honestly, in what we call preclinical studies and even just historical examples, it is not uncommon that you ultimately can switch the different types of vaccines. In fact, some vaccines are more amenable of being boosters. You also, as you know, we are always continuously improving vaccine, what we call formulations, right, where we make them better and more directed. So I wouldn't be surprised, like if you've received an RNA vaccine, maybe later you just get a protein boost, or, if you got the Johnson & Johnson, then you get, some other platform, so I think in the future will be interchangeable. Right now, of course, there's very specific guidelines and we just have to follow the guidelines as presented by the FDA or the CDC. But, I think in Europe, for example, and in some instances, like I've heard, like if you're an immune suppressed person, like that you have very, alteration of your immune response, they're also providing different alternatives of how to better protect you using combinations of Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson or Moderna and Johnson & Johnson.
Okay, very good. There's been a lot of talk about herd immunity and what percentage of the population would need to be vaccinated to achieve that. There's also been discussion whether we could ever even reach herd immunity, but can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts maybe on herd immunity based on the current state that we are in right now?
Yes. So look, so the game here is the following, right? Is one, protect ourselves and protect, of course, our communities. But by protecting ourselves using these vaccines, we're also having an impact on pretty much blocking the virus and reducing the virus circulating in our communities. So just think of it, right? More people get vaccinated, less the virus can replicate in our bodies, because that's what the virus does, right? They are looking to survive. And so if there's less virus duplicating in our bodies, of course, there's going to be less virus transmitted. And eventually you're going to have more vaccinated people, less virus circulating. So that percent that we use, that we say, well, because there's so much virus circulating, we need a lot of people vaccinated. We're always talking about at least 60, 70, 80% of the eligible vaccine population. But that's why now we're also talking about why it's important to incorporate young adults and eventually even pediatrics, because if we think of it, they also can transmit and certainly get themselves infected. So I think it's a balance, right? Now, what we're seeing in the US, it's, a little bit of I call it Apache US, right? We clearly have states that have done really well. Like if you've been hearing the news, like New Hampshire, for example, of course, small state compared to the population size of others, but they've already reached very high levels of coverages, and they're already seeing the impact of not seeing the virus circulating in their community. Clearly a reduction in deaths, hospitalizations. We here in Texas are doing relatively well, but if we were to increase the vaccinations and, of course, people getting more vaccinated, we clearly are going to see much better impact. And similar to we have Apache US, unfortunately, we have a much more patchy world where, in the US or high income countries, we see on average, great access to vaccines. And unfortunately, there's still countries that have almost none. And as we continue to have this patchiness, it's probably going to be very hard that this virus, we are going to be able to eliminate it. So that's why we need to encourage not only vaccinations here, but arguably eventually raise the equity and the distribution also around the world.
Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned young adults and children receiving the vaccine. Now children ages 12 to 15 are able to receive the vaccine. Do we know when it will be available for younger children ages 2 to 11? Also, are there any special considerations for younger children?
So there are studies similar to how initially we did studies in adults. Then, of course, we de-escalated into adolescents. Now there are the ongoing studies all around the U.S. and probably also globally to evaluate again what you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
The younger children and potentially even the infants, right? Even
Mm-hmm.
6 months of age and older. That's a normal process. All vaccines usually go through that, where you first start with adults and then you go de-escalate. I think it may be that they evaluate different injection volumes. Maybe they will consider looking at different formulations. But ultimately, we're seeing that it's becoming quite clear that they are safe. They are clearly very beneficial and they are efficacious. And I think ultimately it will be a great idea that we have full coverage of everybody that needs it. Because again, we don't want to have any populations that this virus can use to keep itself alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Eventually we want to really get rid of it. So the concept of full elimination of the virus versus just managing it, it's still there, right? That's our aspiration.
Right. Noel had just a quick question here. They said there have been recent reports about young people that get the vaccine are having maybe heart issues, heart reactions. Have you seen that or heard that, or are you aware of that at all?
So remember, when you start doing the studies, and including when you're, of course, distributing the vaccines widely, you have all these what we call systems of pharmacovigilance, right? This is a normal practice. In fact, the reason why you're hearing sometimes that we see the pauses of the Johnson and Johnson or the pauses of
Mm-hmm.
AstraZeneca, or the fact that we identified that there's potential of severe allergic reactions in some very specific individuals for Pfizer, Moderna. That's all because we are doing vigilance, right? The good news is that they are very, very, very rare occurrences, including, for example, this occurrence that we've seen that in some cases there's some myocarditis or some, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's very specific just to pediatrics. I think, as they evaluate all populations, you have to evaluate all these potential occurrences. As you know, no medication, no vaccine, no intervention, to be quite honest, right, is 100% perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's always the risks. And what we need to evaluate is how much those risks outweigh the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, the risks of infection by the real virus and the potential risk of very severe, even long COVID, right? The long
Mm-hmm.
haul of the sequelae of the disease, or even having been infected, is much higher than the benefits of these vaccines. So that is why right now there's of course warnings, and there's of course a awareness of what potential risks are, but it's still much beneficial compared to the risks of just getting yourself infected.
Okay. We've heard some people say they won't get the vaccine until it's gone from emergency use authorization to full approval. Pfizer has actually started the process for full approval. What does that mean, and what is the difference between the emergency use authorization and full approval?
Sure. So it's true in a normal business as usual scenario, the companies or the producers that submit the request or for approvals to the regulatory agencies usually do this only once all the large phase 3 clinical trials are completed, meaning completed all the way to the follow-up, right? So it's not just completed when you inject someone, is then there's a certain number of months, sometimes even years, that you follow up before you can close all the records, and then you submit for what we call a licensing request, right? Or a commercialization request.
Mm-hmm.
In a stage of emergency, what has happened is it's requested for use while the phase 3 trials are in this so-called follow-up stage. So
Okay.
advanced enough that you have all the data that support, of course, the safety and the efficacy, but the trials continue to follow those individuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to be quite honest, it's just a long-term efficacy, a long-term safety that I think because we now have so much vaccine also being used in real life that usually wouldn't have happened. That's why it's probably not going to be very different from waiting for a licensure, full licensure, to actually using it now, because right now we actually have not only clinical trial evidence, but real life evidence because it's been distributed under emergency use. So my suggestion is do not wait, because I doubt that there's going to be any much difference. Of course, by law, the regulators have to, of course, review continuously the clinical trial data, continuously the what we call the real life evidence. And that's why the companies eventually, of course, would like to seek authorization. But since we are still in an emergency, there's also some potential constraints of companies to seek that authorization, because we really need to enable others to be able to also be brought into the landscape, because we don't have enough vaccines for the world, right? So we really need to balance. But as far as safety, I would say use them right now.
Okay. There are still some vaccines that haven't come to the market yet, including Novavax and others. I believe Baylor College of Medicine is working on one that's in phase 3 trials. But do we see any other aid on the horizon? Is there any? Because again, you just mentioned that across the world we don't have enough vaccines. Is there any more aid or assistance on the horizon that you know of?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, we have what we call now the second tranche of vaccines that are being advanced, not only Novavax, certainly ours, which again, they're protein-based vaccines. There's another one from Sanofi. They're collaborating with GSK. There's various others globally. You're right. I think that the distinction is we all, again, try to tackle the same component of the virus, but these are more conventional ways of producing vaccines that may increase the ability of scale up. We know that, as you know, is not just an artifact of are they safe and they work, is can we actually make them, right? And can we make them in like millions and billions of doses? So some of these vaccines have a little bit more hardship because there's no supplies, or maybe the complexity of the process. Some others are a little bit simpler, like ours, for example, uses the same system as we make the hepatitis B vaccine. So there's a lot more know-how in how to do that. So I think that's the reason why we need more. And therefore, yes, the US, with the Biden administration, has already been more prominently sitting at the global table. You know, we've seen also that globally there's a call for sharing excess vaccines, supporting the COVAX mechanism, allowing for a more seamless exports and imports of essential supplies, that we need to be able to have all the manufacturers access to produce these vaccines, and at the same time enable and help the other countries in how they can prepare themselves to receive, distribute the vaccines, and also advocate for vaccinations and use and equity use.
Okay, very good. I was walking through the grocery store last week, and I heard on the announcement that they had at the pharmacy ready to go if you want Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, or Pfizer. They had all three available in the pharmacy. So it does seem like we have it available here locally for anybody who wants it. It's pretty easy to find, but like you're saying, globally, it also needs to be available. I want to ask you, because I received this question a lot from members and from some staff members as well when they heard you were going to be on our program. We have seen where somebody who is maybe already had COVID, they previously had COVID, or they were fully vaccinated, test positive for COVID after that. So what does that mean? And, does that matter? Is that just a part of the process? Can you explain that to us?
Sure. So remember, the vaccines were designed with the primary goal to ensure that we can protect ourselves against disease, right? Which is not the same thing as protecting fully against infection. So we've seen some, which is, of course, very important that we don't die, that we don't get so severe with symptoms that we have to get ourselves hospitalized and, of course, even go into intensive care. So the vaccines were really evaluated and designed to try to reduce a person from being symptomatic if you get infected by the virus to become potentially even asymptomatic. Honestly, the ideal would be that even if we're vaccinated, we never get ourselves infected. But if you do, but you can get infected. And if you get infected, the likelihood is that then you are an asymptomatic person, and you most likely are going to transmit also to others, right? So it's not uncommon, therefore, that yes, you may have already had the COVID before, then you get yourself vaccinated, but now you know there's also these new variants circulating. So this allows the virus to also reinfect you. And even if you're vaccinated, you can get infected. The good news is that you most likely are not going to get sick. But that's, I think you're going to ask me, Cristina, I predicted you're going to ask me, and so should I still wear masks, right? And so I know that there's been a lot of new guidelines of when or when not, and what is appropriate and what not appropriate. So bottom line is, look, if you're with a group of people that you know all have been vaccinated, that you also know that you have not really been exposed, right? You know, because as you know, you can still get infected. Then I think it's totally fine, right? But the moment that you're in a location where you don't even know who's vaccinated and who's not vaccinated, and God forbid you certainly don't want to get infected, because I prefer not to get infected regardless, right? Because I don't know
Right.
what does it mean to even have the virus inside my body, right? Even if I don't get disease. But it's really important that we protect with masks, because if we happen to infect someone else and that someone else is not vaccinated, we don't want that someone else to get sick, right? So I think for now, until we don't really see a real reduction in the virus in the very crowded public areas, or when you really don't know who's in the pool of people that is around you, to be honest, I prefer to continue wearing masks. And certainly I don't really want to get myself infected. So I'm a little bit, I have to say right now, I'm going to use masks just also to protect myself.
Okay, very good. I want to discuss boosters a little bit more if we can. So there's been discussions about booster shots. Do you know when those would be available? And also the vaccine, if you've already received your vaccine, for example, maybe you received it in January or February. How long does that protection last? When would we need a booster?
So very important questions, very complicated questions, because as you know, we've been doing the science and we're looking at the evidence as time goes by, right? I mean, it's not like we had history about a little bit about coronaviruses, but we really don't know, right? So the good news is that, if we started vaccinating people in the US back in last December, and today we're in May, we know that the protection is lasting at least up to May. In June, we'll know if it lasts until June. In July, we'll know if it lasts until July, right? So it's looking very promising, right? These vaccines are clearly certainly showing that it's protecting us. Of course, as we get more variants, and if we let these variants really take over, the good news is right now, it seems that they're still quite protective, the vaccines against the variants, but that's why we need, of course, to try to reduce the virus circulating, right? Now, when do clinicians or scientists recommend a booster, and how, because the response is obvious, right? It's going to increase, then it's going to slowly start decreasing. At what level of that decrease you want to kind of give another booster, right? And that varies, right? As you know, there's some vaccines that we never get boosted again in our lives. Some vaccines like flu, we have to do it every year. Some vaccines like tetanus, we get it every 10 years, right? So it really is going to matter depending, again, on how much more virus we are still going to see in our communities. Some people say maybe we can get some people boosted by the end of this year, because it's been kind of a year after they got their first, right? Maybe it's going to be every 6 months. Maybe it's not going to be every year. Maybe it's going to be every 2-3 years. So again, it's going to really depend on how the studies show this curve of immunogenicity and how much memory these vaccines have been able to induce, right? But I would honestly say today, I wouldn't worry too much about boosting because, if you have gotten already the vaccine, you're protected, albeit try to make sure you don't get yourself infected. And now is to really incentivize those who didn't get the vaccine to please go get the vaccine, because it's that balance of more people vaccinated, less virus is going to be able to survive. And eventually we may not even need to boost. But if we do, good for us, right? It means that we actually are going to increase our protection and we're going to feel a little bit more relaxed and less anxiety, especially, if we see that, there's still a lot of these virus circulating.
Okay. You did make mention of this, that it seems to be working well against the variants, but could you just repeat what you said? Amina said, do the COVID vaccines protect against the COVID variants?
Yes, and there's different ways we can evaluate that. Of course, there's the predictions, we call them, where you, of course, look at the structure and look at, some, studies that we do in the laboratory, in animals or, in vitro studies. And those, and it's a sliding scale, right? Some mutations in the virus is giving, of course, more advantage to the virus, and even some possibility that the virus can evade our response. Some mutations in the virus are less protective to the virus. So it's a sliding scale. Fortunately, in the US, I think similar to even in the UK, the predominant variant now, I think around the world, is primarily the one that had the mutation, which is a mutation that was identified in the United Kingdom. We are aware, of course, that now everybody speaks to the mutations that were identified in India, which is a triple mutation in the spike protein, or the P1, which is the one that was a mutation identified in Brazil, similar to the one that was identified in South Africa. So again, more mutations the virus introduces, we have to evaluate, is it beneficial to the virus? How beneficial to the virus, and how deleterious to protect us? But again, sliding scale, all the vaccines right now are protecting. But clearly, we don't know if we're going to lose that protection faster than compared to the original virus. But right now, I wouldn't worry, except again, it would always be better not to get ourselves infected. That's always the ultimate goal, right?
Okay, very good. So backing up a little bit to the questions about boosters, since we don't know if that's going to be needed yet. We don't know if that's going to be available, soon. Somebody who maybe did get their vaccine in December or January, and they're coming up on that 6-month mark, if not already there, do you recommend that they go get an antibody test? And then if they do, what is considered a good number for the antibodies?
Right. So the answer is probably not. There are no guidelines. There's not any indication that it's going to be recommended that you have to go and test your immunological performance. You have to be also very careful, because the techniques that you use are not certainly the same as you diagnose when you're doing like the contact diagnostic tracing. You have to measure very specific type, because the vaccine-induced immunity is not the same. And also you have to recognize that just knowing that you have antibodies or you have some titer, it doesn't mean nothing, because you need to also make sure that you are evaluating what we call neutralizing titers. So I would just not linger too much on that, right? The likelihood is you've got a really good immune response. And we'll know more as the studies are being done. Now, if there are studies that you are willing to participate, I am sure there would be studies where we're evaluating the long-term, memory. Of course, if you were in one of the clinical trials, most likely you are also continuously being followed. But until we don't receive any guidance, a number is not going to say anything to you, right? And whether you have 100 and I have 200 probably doesn't mean anything either. So I would just not, worry about that.
Okay, very good.
Now, On
Yes.
that note, let me just also, of course, it depends also on each individual, right? If you have a very specific risk factor, or for example, God forbid, you have a cancer or you have some other underlying disease, it's always good to consult with your doctor, right? Because the doctor may say, yes, I really want to see how you're responding to the vaccine. But just general public, just going and saying, go in quest and saying, oh, I want you to do this, that there's really no way of interpreting the results right now.
Right. I mean, and it is a concern and something you should definitely probably talk to your doctor about, because those people that were the first ones vaccinated are the over 65 group, the highly immunocompromised people. So definitely maybe some recommendation from your doctor might be helpful there.
Correct.
We did have one other question that came in, and it is about variants again. What is the likelihood of a variant causing a new massive outbreak in the United States?
Well, there's always possibilities, right? And remember that the seeing another surge, again, it's a reflection of indeed the virus, of course, looking for how to continue maintaining its viability, and us not protecting ourselves, going into places where there's a lot of virus circulation, and of course not covering ourselves or distancing. So in this patchy US, it may be. I mean, we've been hearing that there's probably going to be, if indeed we open up the summer months, like if, we go back like nothing were to have happened for the last year and a half, we probably we'll see some spikes. So you just need to be very aware of where you are and what kind of coverage and what kind of virus circulation. We know that the variants are circulating widely, some variants more than others, of course, but it's hard to say, even though similar to how we have seen certainly extreme examples like in India, Brazil, and other locations, it's an artifact again of population density, variant that is circulating, of course, not having access to healthcare, or even just collapsing of the health systems, right? So it's a combination of many factors.
Okay, very good. There was a comment that came in, and somebody just said, I'd like to hear a response to this. So there was a comment that came in that some people have already recovered from COVID. Maybe they have a natural immunity, and not everyone maybe needs a shot. What are your thoughts on that, and what's your response to that?
Sure, and it's true, right? Some people, the lucky group of people who get naturally infected, and they were very lucky being asymptomatic, or maybe even with moderate, very low-level symptoms. Of course, that means they did mount an immune response. But that's one thing that we definitely have very solid data. That natural response is not as strong as what we call the vaccine-induced immunity. That convalescent response really reduces very quickly. And in fact, when we do those studies again to look at how that immunity protects you against variants, is the one that loses the most. So in fact, you have logs of differences between the response against a vaccine-induced immunity against someone who had natural immunity. And it makes sense, right? Remember, because when you see the virus, our body responds against the entire virus, not just the spike protein. So the directed immunity is against the entire thing, and not just very specific. Like the vaccine is very purposely designed to ensure that we find the real Achilles heel of the virus, right? We don't care about other things. So that's the reason why probably just being naturally infected and thinking that is enough to protect you, it's just not going to make it. And that's why, in fact, most people are now getting reinfected, and means that you could get reinfected and probably even get disease, even if you didn't get disease the first time around.
Yeah, very good. There was a comment that some people have had COVID twice. You can't bank on being immune. So great comments there. And thank you for clearing that up, because that is something that we do commonly hear. Dr. Bottazzi, I know we are out of time, but if you have any final thoughts, any final words that you want everyone to know before we wrap up.
Well, I think that we have to use our voices. I mean, you all in your business are constantly meeting people out in the community, right? I mean, you're there to serve the community of Houston or certainly Texas. Advocate, share, point them to where their right information is. Don't fuel certainly the misinformation. If you don't have an answer, go find, certainly the CDC, the FDA, all the medical center institutions have a lot of great information in their websites. You are part of the voice to try to reach to those communities that really need that information to incentivize them to go and protect themselves. Certainly protect yourselves and protect your families and protect the community, trying as much as possible to still maintain the distancing and the masking, because until we don't have that, high level percentage of coverage, it's probably, just common sense to try to protect ourselves.
Okay, very good. Again, Dr. Bottazzi, thank you so much. Our members are thanking you for all this great information, and you definitely cleared up some questions that we had for you. So that is it for this Member Focus Monday. Next Monday is Memorial Day, so we will not have a Member Focus Monday, but we have a very special panel planned for June 7th. So be sure to tune in on June 7th for that panel. We will see you then. I hope everyone has a great week. Dr. Bottazzi, again, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Cristina. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.